All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good quick lunch. Why don't we get moving along? Dr. Kowalja, you with us, sir? Can't hear you, sir. You're muted. Not sure. Can I unmute you?
Now can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
This headset is not working. I apologize.
It's no problem. The good thing is we got it all on tape, so you don't have to worry.
Excellent.
And we're recording for everyone. Go ahead, sir.
So thank you, Judge, for letting us join the meeting last minute. This will not take too long, probably about 10 minutes max. We were asked to deliver an estimate or a look of the distribution of low-income customers across the utilities as a percent of the total population in an attempt to address issues of distribution, equity distribution. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see it now.
Yeah, we got it, sir.
Excellent, excellent. So we use several data sources. Those of you who attended the presentation we had done before know about them, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But there's basically census-based data, along with data from evaluations of the DHCD program for the last over 5 years now. So as you can see here, we start at what's called the PUMA level, which is the public use micro data areas, and we roll up those two utilities. So it's not like perfect roll up because the areas don't overlap perfectly. So we have to make a lot of assumptions and go in and manually assign some households to one utility versus another. So this is not perfect, but I don't think high levels of precisions are needed here. This is more to get an idea where where the concentrations of low-income customers are, and then try to maybe look at how the Empower dollars are allocated to these areas versus where the concentrations are. So as you can see here, we started out with, like I said, the PUMA level. We got the consumption data from our analysis of conducting billing analysis for the last 5 years. So that's using over 10,000 customers. We estimate the average electric use by utility for low-income customers. We get the total number of households from census data. And then we have the total number of households under 250% of the federal poverty. So you see how that's how. Do you see my cursor as I move it, or am I wasting my time?
We can see it, sir.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much. And then you have the percentage. So BGE, for example, 27.3% of total households in BGE's territory are under 250% of the federal poverty. And then we estimate the consumption of these households, again, using our numbers from the billing analysis for the last 5 years. And here's where I took a bit of a heroic effort, perhaps, but I thought I wasn't entirely sure this is accurate, but I thought there's no better group in the world to throw this at than this group. So what I did was I took the total consumption and I multiplied it by 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And the goal was to come up with an estimate of how these low-income customers are contributing to the Empower budget. And I came up with $48 million in 1 year from people who are under 250% of the federal poverty line. And we ran the analysis also under 150 just to see what that looks like, and it's 25 million. I will share the spreadsheet with everybody so individual utilities can see. For example, if we go to PGE, you can see that for the individual PUMAs, these micro data areas. But that's really all. So then I asked myself, if I'm addressing equity, how do I go about doing that? One way to say is like how they contribute $48 million to the total pot. Well, how much of that are they getting back? And according to my most recent estimate and discussing with DHCD, I think the number is approximately 85 million is what the low income budget is. So they contribute 48 million and they receive back about 85 million. But are the 85 millions allocated equitably across the state? I don't really know the answer to that. I have budgets by utilities, but I don't have the actual spent by utilities. We just haven't had enough time to do that yet. And in addressing equity issues, and I think I would throw this back at Jim to see if he agrees. I mean, do you look at the percent? Is this what you use? Percent of households under 250% of federal poverty, or the percent of the total all households that are under the federal poverty line? How many of those are in BGE's territory? I think this is the right metric right here, which says 51% of all households under the 250 reside in BGE's territory. That's it. If you have any questions about how the numbers were created, I'm happy to answer them. But I think probably Jim is a better person to discuss how we assess if this meets distributional equity or not.
All right. Thank you very much, Doc. Appreciate you putting that together. Jim.
Thank you, Dr. Khawaja. Yes, I really appreciate this, and I'm going to have to scratch my head a little bit about it, and it'll be fun to play with it a little. But my initial concern, which I've raised with the group, I should be looking this way. Sorry, I'm looking at the numbers. Is about the point that you just raised, the distribution of low-income households, the distribution of the statewide total of low-income households in the different utility territories, and how do we look at the statewide population and make sure that they receive services equitably and pay for them equitably? And my concern has been that if there's a lot more low-income households in one service territory, and let's say the bill that's been in the General Assembly for a while, let's serve 1% of the low income. Let's save 1% of the low income load annually. To save 1% of the low income load in, if I'm looking at the numbers right, say SMECO territory is going to cost a lot less than saving 1% of the low income load in BGE territory, I think. And so do BGE's low-income customers end up having a much greater surcharge impact because we're trying to reach a lot more households than maybe SMECO's customers? And again, I'm going to have to play with this for a while to see what it tells me. But those are the questions that I think this will really help answer, at least directionally.
Thanks, Jim. I actually would love to work with you on that if you'd like to have a conversation.
Very much.
I did want to look a little bit at energy burden, but I wasn't really sure that we have the information. We can provide energy burden by utility as well, and maybe that's also another way to look at it.
For sure.
All right. Anybody else want to weigh in? Dylan.
Thank you, Your Honor, and thanks, Sammy, for this. I'm going to leave it to the two of you to keep parsing this question, because I think, Jim, you've asked some good questions. One thing that may help tease out this sort of question of, are limited income households paying, more or less in some service territory than the other to receive the similar benefit, is potentially to differentiate, Sammy, the coefficient that you've used in column G based on the utilities. And I can't off the top of my head tell you whether that 0.7 cents, that sounds right to me, that but of course there are different surcharges in the different territories, and so maybe it's that might help parse out any potential inequity across territories to differentiate those surcharge coefficients. We can sort of do that, which should be feasible.
Yeah. So I have to say that at a very, very high level, I think it passed one test in my mind, which was they contribute 48 million and they received 84 million back. It would have been really bad the other way around, right?
Yes.
But still, I was a bit surprised to see that a low-income population even contributing that high of a percentage of the total. Nearly half of their programs are paid for by them.
It surprises me. It surprises me too, Sammy.
All right, Jim. I
Yeah,
look forward
and if the surcharge in BG&E territory was higher than that average, which it may not be, then that would increase that contribution amount compared to what you have here. But actually, I think that's maybe not the case. I think the BG&E surcharge is not necessarily overly higher than the others. One of the utilities could answer that question, but anyway, thank you for this.
You're absolutely welcome. Just one quick, just a side computation here. You know, the number that Jim just mentioned, which is a 1%. Here's the total consumption of low-income customers. Here's 1% of the total consumption. Here's how many households you need to get 1%, just to give perspective of what that translates to. It's a tough goal to meet, but
It's a big number.
yeah. Joe has a question.
Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, Sammy.
I'm always worried when Joe has a question.
No. Let's see. With the contribution to Empower, is that include rate? Is that like a RIM? Is that like a RIM, or rate impacts overall multiplied by the number of customers, or is that just
No? RIM would be probably above and beyond that. That's just straight surcharge on their bill.
Got you. So to the extent that their rate, so this would be across the class. So non-participants in the low-income programs are really getting slammed, or could really be getting slammed. They would have a bigger adverse impact on them, obviously.
Yeah, the surcharge on a non-participant, on any low-income customer is about $100 a year. So the non-participants are just paying $100 and getting nothing, and the participants have a $200+ reduction in their bill. So the participants are about $100 better off, and the non-participants are about $100 worse off.
Yeah, I think that has implications for increasing participation in the programs, where it's an argument for it, in addition to ones you're already making.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Anybody else? Questions or comments for Dr. Kowalja? I know you're obviously seeing this for the first time. So, yes, Scott.
So, I mean, I have a question, and I looked at it real briefly this morning, and had a couple of questions for Sammy, but relative to Jim's 1% and legislation's 1%, and Sammy, you're saying here 1% of the goal. Well, the goal being 1% would be 33,300 units, which is a high lift. But Jim, that would be over 3 years, correct?
Yeah.
I believe that I mean, I don't know what's in the General Assembly right now, but I think it's ramping up to 1% per year.
Right. So
over a 3 to 5 year ramp up.
Right now it's a 3-year ramp up. It's
3 years. Okay. Mm-hmm.
I think it's 0.04, or maybe it's 0.4% in 2023, and then it goes up to 2022, and then to 2024, I think it reaches a 1%. But that would be, I would take that as being, if it's 1%, 33,000 units to achieve 1% over 3 years would be 11,000 per year.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you.
And I just want to say again to Sammy and Scott for for being so agreeable to having Sammy do this work. I really appreciate it. I think it is so much better when we can find our policy positions based on having real data than this hypothetical stuff that we sometimes use. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in? All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Qualja. Appreciate your time. And
Thank you.
Jim and Dylan, I guess you guys were obviously the most involved in the conversation. Is this something you want to obviously go back over, crunch the numbers some, get some questions answered, and come back to the group with something?
Your Honor, and I have forgotten several times just now to say Jim Gravatt on behalf of the Energy Efficiency Advocates. And
We all know.
Yes,
we recognize that voice, sir.
Yeah, we know who I am. Yes, I think so, because we've raised as a potential the idea that it would be good policy to approach low-income equity goals on a statewide basis rather than a utility by utility basis, and I think it would be very useful to flesh this out a little bit, and then we can take a position on that.
Okay.
And bring it back to y'all.
Excellent. Again, I'm just thinking time is next Thursday. Is that you think that'll be a good time to discuss, what you found out, or assuming that's enough time, sir?
Provided that to the extent Sammy wants to participate in the conversation and can, I think so, yes.
Okay. All right, good. Well, at least we got one thing on the calendar for next week. All right. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Dr. Qualja. Appreciate all your help.
Thank you.
All right. Now we move on to the Joe Loper portion of the show. Gross versus net. And the utilities actually put something together and sent it out this morning. So I don't know if we need to set the table again, or if folks want to just kind of weigh in based on the email Joe sent out last week before last week's meeting.
Judge, if you'd like me to give a 1-minute synopsis.
All right, I'll time you. Go.
Okay. So I was just arguing for reconsideration of net to gross. There are basically a couple different reasons I was arguing that. One is the optics of a gross goal. It suggests to people who are not in these meetings that we're saving 2% a year, when actually the impacts are really 1.3% a year based on current net to gross. So that can mislead not only my mother, but also MDE and anyone else who's not steeped in energy evaluation. Second is in terms of incentives, which we've been talking a lot about. It seems to me the goal that utilities are, we're all recognize utilities are going to drive towards whatever the goal is. If the goal is based on gross savings, then they're not going to be worried about whether the savings were actually caused by the programs. They will be trying to get higher gross savings, which may or may not be attributed to the programs. And so there's a perverse incentive, I would argue, there. And then on cost effectiveness, that our cost effectiveness is based on net savings. And so to the extent that there are concerns about alignment of the goals with cost effectiveness, and I'm not entirely clear how that's being done, or whether that will actually be an alignment that will be pursued. But if it is, I would argue that there's a disconnect there as well. And finally, in terms of the challenges with measuring net savings, basically attributing savings to particular programs as opposed to all the other things that are going on in the world, that is a huge challenge. No question about it. We deal with it every day. So I would not suggest in a goal setting or in a PIM setting that you have a net to gross that is based on me going out and doing a net to gross study after the fact. Rather that you would lock them down for the period of the goal or whatever. So if it's 71%, we all decide that that's what the current net to gross is portfolio wide. If we could decide on that, or you could do it at a program level, whatever. But you have an agreement on what that net savings will be over the course of the period under discussion. And so then really what's happening here is the goal. If the goal is a gross goal, it's going to be 1 over 0.7 times the net goal. And so really all you're doing is set your goal level according to whether it's gross or net. If you have a gross goal, it's going to be a higher goal than a net. If you have a net goal, it's going to be lower. But for all the other reasons, I would argue net is the way to go.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. All right. Know where the utilities stand on this. Anybody want to weigh in? Go ahead, Scott.
So I'll throw myself out there. So this is relative to 2022 and 2023, but currently in legislation, there's a House bill and a Senate bill that's going through, and both of those bills would require, at least on the low income side, the part they're changing is the low income side. I'm not sure about the utility side. That and Jen, this answers more of the savings question. So DHCD would have to save 0.4% starting in 23, and then in 2024, let's see, 0.53%, 0.72% in 2025, and 1% in 2026. And this is at the gross energy savings level. So if the work group is proposing something to the commission that's different than legislation, I think that's something we need to consider too. And part of that might be trying to get future legislation to revise how they require savings to be accounted for. That doesn't mean we can't have two goals. I don't know, the challenges that would cause with, determining what those two goals are. But legislation right now is proposing, again, at least for low income, it may be that way for the utilities already. Again, I don't know, but they are proposing it to being gross energy savings.
Scott, do you know the status of that legislation? Is it moving along?
It's a lot further along than it's been in the past. I don't remember which bill has already gone through a third reading. And the opposite, the cross bill, I think, is going through its second reading. So it's amazingly far into the process, much farther than it's been in prior years. Prior years never even made it to the readings.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. Let's see. Oh, don't go anywhere, Scott. Jim just asked, Scott or Joe, off the top of your head, do you know? I just lost it. Do you know the NGT for LI programs?
It's a little bit, I believe, Joe, maybe or Sammy, I believe it's a little bit different for single than for multi, but
Single family, it's 1%. I mean, it's 100%.
100%, right.
So the net savings and the gross savings are the same. I think, Sammy, you remember better. I think it was like 89% or something for the multifamily last year.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I don't think that it's not going to make nearly as big a deal on the limited income side as we're talking on with the other programs. And by the way, I may also be unclear. I thought the objective of the work group was to make recommendations to the commission, who is going to make recommendations to the legislature. And so I may be about the next program cycle, and so I may be missing the boat on that. And events may preclude recommendations going through because the legislature may already make decisions about things, of course. And I would argue that should not preclude the work group from saying what we think is the best answer, and not locking into that.
I think that's a good point, Joe. I think that's exactly right. Just also to make everybody aware that this is what legislation says, and maybe in the report we ought to indicate something that's legislative and recommending a change for the legislation if that's what the work group is going towards, rather than just saying it's a work group recommendation, specifically identifying where there's a difference between legislation and work group recommendation.
Let me just also say that I think there may be some. So, like I said, nobody knows gross and net like we do in this room. Nobody has, few people outside this room have these kind of discussions, including in the legislature. And so I know the word gross is used. I think Dan, you may want to speak up on this, but Dan sent me some stuff that looks like gross is used. But when I look at it, gross, we used to have for our reporting tables for Empower, we had gross and net tables that had nothing to do with net or gross savings, if I recall correctly. And so I'm just wondering whether gross is even defined when people are writing that ledge language. I've been involved with ledge language writing, many years of my career. A lot of times people use terms that are provided to them when they don't, the meaning could be different to different people.
Yeah,
but if Dan's on, he can maybe able to speak to, because I think Dan, the staff provides comments back to the commission, and also, he may have more insight into whether they're, really, whether gross, to what extent gross has one meaning or another, or, is even meaningful.
You're giving me a lot more credit than I deserve on that one, Joe. The word gross does appear in the current legislation for the 2% of, gross retail sales. The baseline is the gross 2016 gross retail sales, including line losses. And I'm imagining there are some bills that I'm not sure how far along they progressed, but they've added some, they just took the 2% goal and made it a 2.25 in 24, 2.5 in 2025, and then 2.75 for beyond, and just changed the percentage of electric savings. I guess the bill with the low income that Scott was talking about, I guess they're just probably just using the same language that's in the current legislation, is adding a goal for DHCD. And most of the language from the commission order back in 2015 is kind of was adopted into the language of 7-211. So I think when people made gross goals recommendations for the commission in 2015, I think the gross was known to be what it is, but I'm not sure who understands what gross versus net is outside of our little group here.
Can I say that the way that that's written really throws me, thinks that it's something different, because it says 2% of gross retail sales, but when we talk about gross, we could be percent of gross retail sales, we could be net retail sales, we could be percent of number of babies born in Michigan in 2015. We could be anything, but what we're talking about in this context for gross versus net is what is actually caused by the program. And so when it says percent of gross retail sales, I don't see where that is really saying anything about whether we're talking about stuff that just happened because the utilities happen to be in the room, or whether it's stuff that actually happened because the utilities were in the room. Does that make sense? Can't ever see your faces side, well, except Judge McLean. He's always looking quizzically at me. So did that make sense, Scott and Dan, or do you see that language, the language distinction I'm making there? Does that?
I don't know. You might be overthinking it, Joe, but
I usually am.
I think legislation underthinks it. I think Joe's right,
true.
where they throw language out there and they don't necessarily understand all the different implications that it could really have. So one of the bills is SB 524, and I think the other one is HB 108. And these are specific to the Empower legislation.
Thanks, Scott.
Well,
Becca, you had your hand up, man?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know the utilities circulated the comments earlier this morning, and apologies for the lateness. We weren't trying to get it just before the meeting. It's just, with all the remaining topics and the items people are wanting to readdress, we're just doing our best to get everything together here. So the utilities, we're looking at the gross savings, which we've supported the continued use of that, because that's what we can, that reflects the results from which the program related actions are actually being taken by participants. With the net savings, I mean, you introduce certain assumptions regarding free ridership or even spillover. I mean, they're estimates after the fact. They change over time. They're subjective based on surveys or observations post implementation. And that just injects a lot of uncertainty and a great deal of judgment. So the utilities were then posed with, how do we meet this target when we know that it could change after implementation has already taken place, and therefore we didn't have an opportunity to either tweak our program implementation or tweak our budgets in order to make sure that we achieved compliance. So, I mean, that's where we really struggle. We've supported the continuation of the gross goals, and then, back when several months ago when we were working towards a goal structure as a working group, we agreed to goals based on the gross savings being appropriate going forward. So considering we already had that agreement, we thought we were, all on the same page there. But, if it's decided that net savings should be used, any methodology and the inputs that are used to calculate the net savings, that should be determined prior to any goal setting. This way that at least there's consistent methodology that can be used when calculating compliance. So just saying it another way, any goals set, it should have specific free rider estimates, if applicable, spillover estimates, and those same estimates should be used to determine compliance. This way utilities aren't penalized for any non-compliance post-evaluation. So yeah, Joe, I see you have a comment back, so you can go ahead and I'll try and respond to it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to meet your proposal that, have all the methods be decided up front and raise you one, because I think the actual net to gross numbers need to be decided up front. And just like I think a lot of the gross savings, a lot of the other things we talk about will have to be decided before you can be, well, if I was a utility, I would not make an agreement until I knew what all those numbers were that I was, committing to meet, and or at least all the things that are outside of my control. And so, so I, in the email I sent proposing that this be revisited, I very much, maybe I should have written a longer paragraph on that, but I definitely think that this should be something that would be locked down, that it's not creating a risk for anybody. My concerns are really about the optics and what gets communicated about Empower, and that, we've been, at least, MDE and others think that Empower is saving 2% a year for the last, 12 years or whatever, and they're expecting it to continue, when actually it's, right now it's probably saving 1.3%. That number's been lower in the past. And so that's my biggest concern. So I agree. Just want to make sure, Becca, that I do agree with y'all on locking it down and not creating more uncertainty in the system, especially in the context of a goal or PIMS type setting.
All right, thank you, sir. Jim.
Thank you, sir. Jim Grabat on behalf of the Energy Advocates. And Joe, I don't particularly disagree with you on that, but some parameters or caveats on the locking it down. I think it's a different discussion if we're talking about a 3-year plan versus a 5-year plan. And I believe the utilities initially proposed a 5-year plan period. Locking down net to gross for 5 years that's a lot. And I also just want to say, locking it down, and I'm sure you agree with this, Joe, because I think this is, I believe it's consistent with what's happened with some of the LED savings. It doesn't mean the same value every year. You may make assumptions about what's going to happen over the 3-year period or the 4-year period, so that some measures might have a different value in year 1, year 2, and year 3. But there's agreement about the methodology and what those values are.
But doesn't that make the utilities, put the utilities in a tough spot? Because how are we supposed to work towards a compliance target if it's changing year over year post when we've already taken that action? So that's why we really wanted the gross savings goal. I mean,
Yep. But
savings for compliance and targets is great, but net for, you know, cost effectiveness or measuring market transformation. We understand that. So
I'm not suggesting that you wouldn't have the information, you know, when you're making the plans and when the goals are approved. I'm agreeing with you that you need to know those things.
Just
I
maybe
guess I
not
was
as long.
confused.
Fair.
Yeah, I guess I was confused when you said, you know, there could be variances. I don't know if that was the exact word you used, but what I heard was there could be changes in during each year. So I think that's where I was getting confused. But we
Would
just
you
had
mind if I try to strike a balance, Jim? Or
Sorry, Joe?
Would you mind if I address? I think I can address both of you at the same time, if that's okay. Let me just try.
Well,
okay.
Let me do something really quick, and then you can. Is that all right?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So let's say it's 2018, and I'm going to get the years right. Let's say it's 2018. You're filing a plan for the next 3 years, and there might be agreement in the EM&V subgroup that in 2019 you're going to get 40 kilowatt hours a year for an LED bulb, and in the next year you're going to get 30, and the next year you're going to get 20. And I think, Joe, I think that some of that actually has occurred, hasn't it? Where because the net to gross changes over time, because we can see what's happening in the market. So that's what I'm suggesting, is that there might be that agreement beforehand, but it might not be the same value for the entire period of the plan. Okay, Joe, you go.
Yep. And so I was just going to say that, yeah, I don't think there's any, when I say lock it down, I don't think there's any need that the net to gross needs to be 50% for 3 years. It could be 50, 40, 30, it could be 100, whatever. Right. And so I totally agree with you on that. But that's still, even if it's 50, 40, 30, the utilities then have certainty when they go and agree to a goal or whatever, that, you know, what they're going to get on the net to gross. So there's no added, the objective there in my mind is not to add uncertainty to the utilities. And let me just add right now, everybody, you got certainty, right? You got 100% net to gross is what you got. That's basically how it's being treated. From my mother's perspective, when she sees that we're getting 2% savings a year, she's assuming the utilities are driving that savings, and we're telling her that, you know, we are, when actually we're doing 70%. And so I guess that would be my argument. If anyone was arguing, oh, we should not lock down net to gross, we should do it on an annual basis and then kind of penalize the utilities for it, I would say, well, you know, in your negotiations, consider that right now we got the worst of all worlds, which is 100% net to gross locked down for perpetuity.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that.
I didn't think you were. Just addressing it, anticipating in case.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, Dylan, you had your hand up a while ago. Do you want to jump in, or you good?
I just was Nicole can make comments about sort of OPC's position on this. I just was going to point out to the utilities that I think what Jim is proposing, what Joe is proposing, you know, in terms of locking down a lot of things, and Jim as well, is, you know, I think that's sensible. I would say not all jurisdictions even give the utilities that. There are jurisdictions where there remains variables that are determined to be, you know, things that the utilities can have impact on in their program designs, and so they don't get locked down, and it creates risk for the utilities, but it's deemed to be risk that the utilities should be designing around. I'm not advocating anything. I'm not advocating that position. I suspect that doesn't make sense for Maryland, but I do think it's useful to know that, you know, sometimes folks deem that there are things that the utility should control for, and how they design programs can actually affect net to gross. So in some jurisdictions, the regulators say, hey, you guys have to control for that. You have to manage that. So I think what Joe is suggesting is, more kind of middle ground in terms of balancing out the risk on utilities. But again, don't take that as sort of position on any of this.
All right, we got a few hands up. We'll go Lindsay, Joe, and then Jim.
Thank you, Judge. And Lindsay North, PHI. So just, I wanted to go back to one of the points that Becca made, and sort of her initial response, was around that, that this piece was part of a negotiated element that we settled on several months ago. So I just have a little bit of concern about opening it up when it was a key part of the discussion. I wasn't part of those discussions, but I know other people were. So I just kind of, Joe, was hoping you could react to that and get your thoughts.
Yeah, let me I'll respond to Dylan first in terms of some jurisdictions don't lock things down and take it as it will. I would actually welcome those examples, Dylan. I want to go dig in on them. And my experience, and this is my perception, which could be totally wrong, and that's why I want to go dig, poke around, is that in those jurisdictions that they do not have as intensive a verification process as we do, and that things are not as unlocked down as they might appear from the outside. But I'm not concluding that. I just would like to, I would like those would be great examples for me to go look at just for my own edification, because I want to understand if to the extent that Maryland is going into a more perhaps challenging regulatory environment around goals and PIMS, I need to anticipate and understand how things are going to change, whether that's in terms of process or in terms of just different stakeholders engagement or analytics itself. There's a lot to it. So I appreciate that. Dylan would love to talk some more about that.
Yeah. Okay.
And then Lindsay, to your point, for me, I don't see what the difference is. If we're locking down the net to gross in the way that I've characterized it here, I don't see why you should care whether it's a gross or net goal, as long as you know beforehand. And then the goal, so presumably nobody's talked stringency of the goal yet. So presumably if you had a net goal based on our current net to gross, if you had a net savings goal, it would be 1.3% a year. And if you had a gross savings goal, it would be 2% a year. And so from that perspective, they should be equal, unless the utilities are thinking they can use gross savings to make it, they can go and build programs that are not actually going to save energy based on what they did, but claim savings towards gross savings. And I can talk about examples in the portfolios currently where that's, I think, is driving some of the interest in those particular programs. And that's what I, as an evaluator person looking, and also a Maryland ratepayer, taxpayer, person, is what what bugs me about the goal. There's no incentive, or there are actually incentives for the utilities to go just touch things, give $1 here, give $1 there, or whatever, so that they can claim the savings towards it, even if when they know that they're not having an impact.
There's a lot to unpack in that, Joe. This is one of the downsides of asking you a question. So I'm going to try to elaborate, I think, on some of the things that you said. So I think first, to your last point about not having a direct touch, I think that's dependent upon the program, right? And I think you could probably come up with some examples where that is very clear. And I think there are some other programs where I think we probably have a pretty solid sense for the relative impact that we have. And maybe you're suggesting that's what we could do as part of this sort of locking it down scenario section. I think what gets to the bigger point and sort of back to the principle of this is that, we sat down as a group and had a negotiated discussion where this was an area of interest for the utilities. And I think going back on it just seems like not a great way to go about, setting up the future. And I think to your point about how things may change, I think there's a potential when we move from a gross to a net scenario that it might be more of a challenging discussion between evaluation and the utilities, because as Becca sort of mentioned, and I think other people would agree to some degree, when you look at net, it's somewhat subjective what you might call net versus how we look at gross. So I didn't respond to everything you said, but that was just my perspective and our reaction about this is something we agreed upon just a couple of months ago. It seems a little premature to already look to walk that back, given everything we have going on moving forward.
So I'm not a voter on this. I just am trying to inform the group and inform the commission and other stakeholders that, on my daily life about, what, how different things are going on that are related to evaluation. And I could come up, and I don't want to, but I can send out a list of, at least a half dozen kind of major instances of programs where we have a major disconnect between the savings that are being claimed by the utilities towards a gross savings goal versus the actual impacts of the programs. And so if you're not going to have, and by the way, I am happy to provide that if anybody wants it. But my concern, if the goal is going to be based on gross, then I guess my question is, what are your guardrails around net to gross ratios? If all of the programs you could meet goal, everybody's happy, looks good, the legislature won't know any different. Everybody will think everything's going fine, but you've spent $300 million and you've actually caused a fifth of the savings that you're claiming. And that's for me, that's the fundamental question. If you're taking credit for programs that are, let's say the federal government decides that they're going to impose, new standards, or Maryland's right now. I think there was some comments just the other day about new building codes, or the county level or state building codes. Montgomery County, I think, is what they were referring to. If those could affect you could go and continue doing what you're doing, have good gross savings, but then the net savings are going to be could be much lower, depending on whether those are counted as a federal standard or whether it's market practice, or how we treat it. Ultimately, somehow it seems to me that everybody is really they're not asking who did you give money to, they're asking how much impact did we have. Sorry, stop. By the way, I'll stop arguing, because I think I've made my case plenty of times, and whatever happens, happens. Thank you for letting me get my my positions out.
Judge, do you mind if I say one more
No,
thing?
no, please.
I'm trying to. I may have lost my thought. Joe, you're so good at weaving so many things in. It just fries the brain. Let me try to collect and come back.
No problem. Jim.
Jim Grabata on behalf of the Energy Efficiency Advocates, and I'm probably going to have the same problem that Lindsay's having. Thank you, Joe. But a couple of things. I was going to start by saying, on the whole locking it down question, there are parameters that would have to be considered, and I think Dylan's raising this point is what triggered the thought for me. I mean, when we're talking about the volumes of a measure within a program context, the incentives that are paid, those things have an impact on the net to gross. So if there's all this agreement, this discussion, negotiation happens, the plans are filed, we all agree on what the net to gross values are going to be, the utilities have certainty, and the plan was based on, Pepco is going to promote 1,000 ductless mini split heat pumps, and then they say, well, this has pretty good net to gross, let's go out and promote 1 million of them. that's going to change the net to gross. So there would have to be some kind of way in those discussions of, and I'm not talking about locking it down to only that number, but if you do 10 times what you were proposing or something, then I think that's fair grounds for reopening the net to gross discussion. That was one. I also just want to comment on the idea that Loper et al. And commission staff are walking back from an agreement, because honestly, I don't really see it that way. How I think it was presented, and certainly how I heard it, was we've given this a lot of thought over the course of the last few months as we've been discussing many issues. And, you know, based on everything that's going on, we actually think this would be a better metric, and we want to reopen that discussion. I just don't see it as quite like walking away from a settlement or something, which is a little bit what it sounds like. But I also really want to agree with Joe that, you know, what is actually accomplished in the programs is what matters. And so if we're using a metric that doesn't actually do a good job of measuring that, then that might not be so successful. And we've talked a bit today and other days about perverse incentives too. Gross savings goals can create perverse incentives for utilities to spend ratepayer dollars on things that don't actually get that much. So I do think net is a better metric. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Lindsay.
Thank you, Judge. Lindsay North from PHI. So I remember what I was going to ask you, Joe. So we have existing processes in place to address this in our current evaluation process. Is that right? I may assume.
You mean to estimate net savings?
Correct.
Yes. Yep. And we do. And where it really gets, it doesn't really get used that much. I don't hear anybody talking about it, except really it gets used in the context of cost effectiveness. And occasionally there have been some complaints about, you know, Energy Star retail products platform or something being 5% net to gross. And we got upstream lighting is now 20% net to gross. It has been very low for a couple of years. It's probably going to go lower. And that's why I asked about guardrails. The problem with cost effectiveness, the way cost effective this, I don't want to twist you around the axle, Lindsay, but the way cost effectiveness is done is the net to gross ratio gets applied not only to the benefits, but also to the costs. And so you can have net to gross, you can have your cost effectiveness by a TRC test looking good for a long time, even though your net to gross could be zilch. Your net to gross could be, you know, 5% or something on a lighting program, and the TRC is still looking good. So there's no real, you know, in my mind, the notion of whether all your money is going to free riders, you know, just kind of doesn't hit the radar of commission and other stakeholders. And I think the goal, that's why the goal contributes to that. Everybody's just kind of really focused on the goal. Are we making our savings? Do we get the 2%? And that's the, you know, main focal point. The commission just wants it done at whatever lowest cost is, and try not to put too much impact on the surcharge. Just make the goal, and that goal, we could make that goal and you could have, you know, 95% of your money could be going to pay for ice cream to people practically, not achieving any savings, and nobody'd know the difference. That's an overstatement. I'm sorry. I shouldn't use ice cream, but could be going for, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but going for activities that are paying for things that are already happening. Then it becomes a big transfer of money as opposed to money being paid to induce changes in investment or behavior.
Okay. And so it's not that you're necessarily unhappy with the existing processes. Is that what I'm hearing, or you just think it could be more accurate?
It's the nature of me to be unhappy with our processes all the time. So yeah, we're always tweaking it, including net to gross and everything else, but we're doing it as well as anyone, I think. And when I'm proposing this, if there was no option, if somebody was proposing this to us, we're going to do net to gross and we're going to decide it after the fact, I would not be proposing it. I would be opposed to it. It'd scare me. But I'm proposing that we take our best information, use it to project a net to gross for whatever the period of the PIM or the goal is, and then include that, and then do a net goal or a net PIM. And then we continue to do our net to gross research and studies as we do to inform the next program cycle and for our cost effectiveness for stakeholders and others to be able to make decisions about portfolio. In the next period, we're still informing ourselves about that net to gross. So it could be the case that we projected a net to gross of, say, at the portfolio level of 70% each year, and then we get out at the end of the period and really the net to gross was 80% or was 65%. That's fine. We want to report that for future, but it wouldn't affect your whether you get your PIM or get your incentive or whether you meet your goal. That make sense? We have the bottom line here is we have the processes for net to gross. We do it as well as anyone here, but I would not in any jurisdiction not lock down net to gross. I would never say you need a PIM. There's some jurisdictions, as Dylan said, does do it. But I would not recommend that in Maryland that we have a goal or a PIM based on net to gross and then say it's going to be whatever we estimate based on our self-report surveys, and multi-state market analyses.
This is Becca Potomac Edison. I'll just go ahead and jump in. So, Joe, I struggle with, I heard you earlier say going gross savings, the 100% attribution, that's terrible, just as terrible as the not knowing your net till after the fact. But even if we're locking in a net savings ahead of time, so you made, like, I think it was the 80-50-30 example, those are still just based on information that are estimates that, like you just said, could vary over time. And while it might be locked in for the program cycle, they're still not what is really necessarily happening in real time. I mean, that's part of the reason the utilities are on the side of gross, is because at least that's something that's occurring in real time. Does that make sense? I mean, there's still this, the bias, this potential survey bias, estimations. If you're saying, well, net savings is only 80% for the first year, 50% for the second year, 30% for the third year. I mean, that estimation is still occurring, while gross does not have necessarily that estimation.
Well, I guess my first reaction is that I think maybe there's a perception amongst a lot of people that we just go evaluate gross savings based on some engineering calculations. You multiply your participants by the by the hours of use for the lamp, by the et cetera, and it's a clear engineering formula. And if Sammy and I and Dylan and all the other people in this room did those calculations, we'd get exactly the same number. That is not the case. Or if others think that is the case, y'all can challenge me on this, but that's not my experience. Is evaluation is subject to enormous amounts of professional judgment and back and forth in negotiation, just like we're doing in this room. I do this every day with our utility evaluators, with our utilities, any other stakeholder. Dylan and I go at it, at least once every couple of weeks, and to discuss all the different uncertainties around savings evaluation, because it can't be, because energy efficiency cannot be metered, and so there's uncertainty all around, and I would not dismiss. And so, yeah, I totally agree that with net savings, there is a lot of uncertainty. With most of the programs, you're basically going out and asking, a schmuck like me, what would you have done but for the program? Usually I don't know what I would have done but for the program. The program was there. So how do I know what I would have done? So you're asking them to kind of guess what they were going to do otherwise. That's a very uncertain and challenging enterprise. I have no I have no disagreement with that. But basically what we're doing right now is assuming, well, one, I've already proposed how we would deal with that, and that is to lock it down. We'll figure out our best estimate, just like I got a best estimate of the hours of use for a light bulb. I got a best estimate for the net to gross. We lock that down so that you're not dealing with that uncertainty. I'm basically, my proposal is assuming that you don't have any control over that net to gross, even though I totally agree with Dylan that you do have control over some of it, right? And just that, I would also argue the utilities have some control over hours of use for light bulbs. If you're going and installing light bulbs in closets, you're going to have lower hours of use than if you're putting them in kitchens. So the uncertainty is just all around. My biggest concern with this, beating a dead horse here, my biggest concern is that right now we're saying that the net to gross is 100% in effect. We're saying the programs are causing, a lot more savings than they actually are. And that the programs then, could be, if there was any inclination, if you were like short on goal, there could be an inclination to go and achieve goal through getting gross savings where that there's not, the savings would not really be attributed to the program. Not that y'all would do it, but if I were you, I would go meet the goal. However, I got to meet it. And if it's a gross savings goal, I can get you there easier than, with some free ridership.
A couple hands up, but Jim, you had your hand up a while ago.
Well, I was going to say something and then I wasn't, and now I am again, which is to your question, Becca, or your observation, I guess, that a gross savings goal is a better measure of what is actually happening than a net savings estimation might be. Perhaps that's true, but I would say that it is not a better estimation of the value of what's happening. And I think that's the point that Joe is making as well. Gross savings doesn't measure what effect the utility has on achieving them. And I think it's more useful to look at the effect that's being caused by what the utility does than by what's just happening. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Lindsay?
I think everybody is tired of this conversation. Sorry, Lindsay from PHI, but I want to make one last comment here, Joe, just to kind of, I think you said this, but I wasn't sure. I just wanted to see if this is how you were thinking. So is it your sort of thought process that a possible outcome of moving to this type of, and I forget the actual, I can't think of the word, but if we were to move to net savings, that it would put upward pressure on our budgets because it would require us to spend more money to do things?
I don't think so, because the way I'm thinking, with everything locked down in front, when they go do the potential study, like AEG or whoever is doing the potential study, they're going to do a gross savings and they're going to do a net savings, right? And so I would say if you were purely, and I know everybody's said they're not going to, but if you were purely going with the potential study to decide what your goal is going to be, you got your two numbers right there. So it's a simple, I wouldn't even, presumably they're going to be informed by net to gross studies in Maryland, and that will be used in their assumptions. So, at this point, I would guess it's going to be roughly, the net savings will be 0.7 times the gross savings. And therefore, I would argue that if you did a gross goal, it should be, higher than if you did the net goal. In fact, if you did a net goal just solely based on the potential study, it should be 0.7 times whatever your gross savings goal is going to be. Right? That's why I said, so if you did this 10 years ago, instead of doing 2% a year, arguably you would be doing 1.3% a year goal, but it'd be a net savings goal rather than a gross savings goal. Does that make sense?
I guess and maybe we should follow up offline, Joe, because I just go back to there was a reason that we felt strongly about this back when we had this discussion earlier on. And I guess I'm not really understanding the value of reintroducing this this conversation, where we are, where we've got a lot of other things that we're trying to lock down. So that's one thing. And then I think the separate thing is, especially given, it seems like we have existing systems in place to address this. And this isn't the last time that we can address this issue. So that's, I think, what I'll say in parting, because I'm not sure we're, I don't know that I can understand any more than what you've said. Maybe I've reached
No.
my max capacity of what I can intake from Joe today.
Well, I'm happy anytime to talk you through it or to talk me through it, whatever we need to do on that. You said something about systems. Yeah. Well, I'm happy. I think the systems are in place. By the way, I know what it was. If the utilities in their comments said, if you did do it, we would like this, have things locked down. Here's what I would recommend to the group. If you decide to stay with the gross savings goal, in your working group recommendation, provide recommendations for some guardrails on net savings, so that you don't have a situation where, the utilities are, motivated to go achieve gross savings by doing things that don't affect anything. And, so that's another way to do it. But somewhere in the system, I would argue you should have a guardrail or goals or whatever that are addressing this issue of what savings are actually attributable to the programs.
Okay. Anybody else want to weigh in? All right. Which leads to the next question is, where do we go from here on this? And I'm not, and to kind of follow up with what Jim was saying, I agree. It's not necessarily they're withdrawing from a settlement or, but maybe they're revisiting it. Is it fair to say that that portion of the settlement is, I don't want to say dead, but maybe on life support? Go ahead, Nicole.
Thank you, Your Honor. Nicole Zeigner on behalf of OPC. Your Honor, we do need a little bit additional time to talk about this. We haven't been able to discuss it as an office yet. So maybe I can discuss this at the next meeting or even submit comments.
And that's fine. I figured that's kind of where we were going. We can add that to the low income equity distribution discussion we had with Dr. Qualja for next week. Anybody else want to weigh in on that? If you guys want to submit comments in advance of next week's meeting, that'd be great. But if not, that's fine too. We just, again, hoping that we have maybe 2 more meetings left to nail things down. Anybody got anything else? At least on this topic? All right. The last thing I had was, Taylor, are you on the call? Or maybe somebody from the utilities. Oh, Lindsay. Taylor was going to look into, I guess, the utilities planning process and when's that going to start in relation to the results of the potential study. Just wondering if you guys had a rough guesstimate on that.
She did not share that with me.
Okay.
So I will follow up with her
All right.
and get back to you. That's
Fair,
okay, Judge.
fair enough. Thank you very much. All right. That's all I had on my agenda today. Is there anything I missed or anything anyone else wants to raise now or to get on the calendar for our St. Patrick's edition of our work group?
Judge McLean, I have 3 things that I was hoping we could reconsider.
Only 3. Okay.
I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I'm done.
All right. All right. So at least we got a couple things to talk about next week, and hopefully the utilities and OPC will get their questions and answers squared away. So we can either talk about that on the 17th or hopefully on the 24th. All right. And unless there's anything else, we will see everyone next week then.
But see you later.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.